Good morning and welcome to Delaware Engineering, Governing During the Time of COVID. This is our third in a series of panel discussions. First, we began with 3 mayors in the Hudson Valley, and then we went to 3 county executives. And this morning, we're going to take a look at 3 new state senators. And boy, do I ever feel like I'm dropping in on a episode of 30-something. We're very delighted this morning to have Michelle Hinchey from the 46th District, Mike Martucci from the 42nd District, and Elijah Reichlin-Melnick from the 38th District. They're all in their 30s and they're all brand new to the legislature. And I want to say, a shout out to all of them for not just having the desire to be engaged in a discussion about how to make life in the Hudson Valley better, but to then have the guts and the desire to want to actually put themselves on the line, run for office, and be involved, which, many people have opinions. They share it on social media. Very few get to do what these 3 people did. Joining me for the first half of the discussion from Pattern for Progress is Michelle Pfeffer. Michelle is also a 30-something. And we thought it would be better and more fun to have Michelle handle the first half of the discussion about how it is that Mike, Michelle, and Elijah got here. So, Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. We're so pleased you could join us today. So we'll have the senators jump on here. And before we get to questions on policy, we want to start off with how you got here today. So I'd like to start off with, why did you decide to run for office, and in such a period when confidence in government has been kind of low? So Elijah, you want to start us off?
Sure. So I decided to run for office. Well, first of all, because the seat was open. The incumbent who'd been there for 10 years decided not to run for re-election and to attempt to head to Congress, although he was unsuccessful in that campaign. But having worked for 2 years for State Senator James Skoufis, who's another young 30-something representing our region, as his legislative director, and being able to see the incredible progress that the legislature made in 2019, with the first time that we had a Democratic state Senate in a generation or more, that was really an inspiration. You know, Albany, for most of my life, has been the butt of jokes. It's a place where good ideas go to die. It's a perpetual gridlock. It was, you know, decades of the Democratic Assembly fighting the Republican Senate, fighting various governors. And finally, to see an opportunity to do things for people and not just go up there and fight, made it a phenomenal time. We have so many needs in our region. I represent Rockland and Westchester, but throughout the Hudson Valley, there are so many needs, from our schools to our infrastructure, our business community, taxes, all of these things, which I think we can now make some real progress on. And so to have this opportunity to serve in the state Senate at a time when Albany's actually delivering for people was something I couldn't possibly pass up that chance. And that's why I threw my hat in the ring.
Oh, glad to have you there. How about you, Mike?
So good morning, Michelle. You know, I guess the expression is, I guess really like both Senator Hinchey and Senator Reichlin-Melnick, I'm born to the Senate, so I never ran for public office before. This is the first seat that I held. I'm coming to Albany and going directly in the Senate. My experience is one of having come out of business. I started a school bus company back when I was 22 with one school bus. I was the first driver of the company. I drove a school bus, and just as soon as I saved up enough money to buy a second school bus, I did that. My grandma was my very first employee. And over the 10 years to follow, was blessed to surround myself with some of the most phenomenal people, get support from a business community in the Hudson Valley at large, and built the company from that first school bus to a company of just shy of 600 employees. So for me, I had the experience of riding in the front seat of the roller coaster, you know, in terms of job creation here in the state of New York, in terms of, you know, working with our school districts and our communities across the region. So it's something that I always had interest in. I always wanted to run for public office. I never thought it would be now, but in 2018, I had the opportunity to sell my business. And, you know, here I sit. I think that in my life, I always envisioned this being much later. So I didn't think I'd be part of the 30-something club here, but sometimes things just work out that way. And that was certainly one reason. I think the second is, you know, I'm blessed to have a beautiful family at home. I have a wonderful wife and 3 children. I have a 5-year-old son, a 4-year-old daughter, and a 1.5-year-old daughter at home. So my 3 kids are a lot of my inspiration. You know, I was so blessed to be able to grow up here in New York in the region that I represent. And I want my kids to be able to do the same. I think that everyone has the ability, who has the ability should consider stepping up and running for public office, because it really is a very high calling. And I guess finally, just to end with sort of answering your question, why did I run at a time when you know, there's such a low faith in government and politics are so divisive? You know, I think the reality here, one of the things I've learned in my first roughly 100 days on the job, is that, you know, sane minds can come to different conclusions. That's okay. You know, I don't always agree with my colleagues here on this Zoom. We agree on a lot, we disagree on some, and that's okay. And that's what makes government so effective, because it really is our responsibility to use our collective wisdom to come to conclusions that are in the best interest of all New Yorkers. And we can do that together, and we do that well because we come from different backgrounds in different areas. So I feel really blessed to serve, and I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Michelle, how about you?
Hi, thank you. I'm really excited to be here too. Thank you so much for holding this forum and for inviting us today. You know, my pathway here is a little bit different in the sense that I grew up seeing fundamentally and firsthand the kinds of positive impacts you can have in your community through public service. My father, my whole life was either, when I was very young, he was in the New York State Assembly. And then for most of my childhood and adult life, he was in Congress. And the way we would spend time together would either to be jump in the car and go travel the district to different events and meeting different people, or we'd go back to school shopping at the Hudson Valley Mall, and a trip that should have taken maybe an hour, maybe two, would take 3, 4, 5 hours, because we would stop and talk to everyone who approached him. And, so starting at a really young age, starting at 6, I heard everything from, please help me, I can't get my veterans benefits, to thank you so much, you helped my mother be able to stay in her home. And that really shapes the way that you see the world. And on the flip side of that, I also saw the negative sides to being involved in public service, the demands on your time, and that, you can't make everybody happy, and you can have very hearty, good disagreements. I agree with my colleague, Senator Martucci, but sometimes it's hard to live in that space all the time, especially as the child of someone who is facing that every time you go out together. And so I ran from it for a long time. I actually, I'd been asked when I was going to run since I was 7. So it was always in my mind as something that was an opportunity and an option, which I'm very blessed to have. But I also saw the negatives. And so it was important for me to see what else was out in the world. And I spent the last 10 years working in communications in the private sector for technology companies and media companies, and learned a lot and did a lot of really incredible and exciting things. But at the end of the day, for me, I always felt like there was a lot more to do and to give back and to be involved. And, seeing firsthand the kinds of positive impacts you can have when you bring different constituencies to the table and you foster that conversation and you have the tough conversations, really how you can change and make people's lives better. And similar to my colleagues, I grew up here, born and raised in Saugerties, and I want to raise my future family here. This is where my friends are raising their families, and much of my family still lives. And when I looked around to see, we need people in office who are young and hungry, right? Who have the energy to show up, especially when you have a district like the 46 that spans 5 counties across 3 different regions. You have to make sure that you're accessible and that you're available and really beholden to the people who elected you and sent you to office. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to show that that's the kind of representation that we all deserve. It's the kind that I grew up seeing. We've seen some people are really great at it. Others in office, had kind of let that go a bit. And I thought I saw an opportunity for me to step up and try to shape the world that we all want to live in, especially as it pertains to climate change and job development and healthcare access, and infrastructure here in upstate New York. Communities that often feel and quite frankly are left behind and left out of the conversation. And I think I agree with a lot of my my colleagues' comments where this is. It's always important to run for office, but arguably it's never been more important to run for office, to be able to try to build that consensus and to work with people both in your party and across the aisle to bring us back to a place where we can have meaningful conversations. And I think that this is really one of the most important times to do it. And I thought that we might as well try it similarly to my colleague, throw our hat in the ring and see if we're able to bring people onto our team and show them what we can do.
Awesome. And so you all had to run a campaign in a really unique time during a pandemic. What was it like to run a campaign during COVID? Senator Martucci?
It was a real challenge because it's very hard as a new candidate. I had been elected to the village board of trustees in Nyack where I live, but that is an entirely different ballgame than running for state senate. And so I knew going into it that there would be an enormous number of people who did not know who I was. I was not a household name. And normally you get to meet people, you go knock on doors, you go to events, you go to local football games, you find ways to shake hands, to get yourself introduced. None of that was possible after the first few months of the campaign. And so trying to retool and realize this is going to become about doing these virtual events, trying to find a way to communicate with voters through through the mail, get volunteers to make phone calls for us and just try to retool on the fly. I have some experience in campaigns, so I thought I had a good idea of what it would take to run for Senate, at least on the campaign side, and that was all out the window. I announced in December 2019, so I had about 3 months or so of normal campaign and then upended the apple cart, so to speak. So I think it was a challenge, I'm sure, for all of us. And although in a way, I guess for my two colleagues here, since their districts are so much bigger, perhaps in some ways it was easier to be able to get to events on the, all the far corners. It takes me about 45 minutes or 50 minutes to get from end to end of my district. Michelle and Mike, I'm sure it takes a lot longer to get from one end to the other. So, and I would actually just add, just on the last question, which I was thinking about, like why now would we want to run? Because one of the things I did notice when I was in Albany, and Senator Martucci kind of alluded to this, you don't have to wait. There's a stereotype that state legislators, particularly state senators, should be well into middle age before they do this. And seeing what happened after the 2018 election, when there were a number of new members elected in their 30s and even 1 or 2 in their 20s, you realize you don't need to wait until you're in your 50s or 60s to run for high office. I'm at 36. There's probably 10 senators now who are younger than me, which is, kind of remarkable to think about. So we have a youth movement in the state Senate, probably the largest, maybe the largest ever.
Senator Martucci, how about you? What was it like running a campaign during COVID?
Oh my gosh. So look, Elijah hit it right on the head. I mean, I think the reality is, for me, at first it was a little bit like, what do you do, right? I mean, you're sitting around during the day and you're saying, I know I should be doing something. I know I should be talking to people. I know I should be doing something. But when you take out like the campaign book, the what to do, you can't do anything in the book, right? So for me, where we immediately pivoted was just, how can we help, right? Because part of my attitude in all of this was, I think we all certainly thought, at least initially, that COVID was going to happen a lot quicker, if that makes sense. And we thought, oh, you know what? It'll be a couple weeks. In a month, we'll be back to regular life. And when we get back to regular life, we can do what we've got to do. But yeah, so I think the first thing was, and by the way, I think it worked to our benefit, potentially being all 30 somethings, that we got to throw the old book away. Because I think the way campaigns were run is they take the old book out, they blow the dust off of it, they'd open it up and say, well, here's how you run a campaign. But the good news is we got to jettison the book and we got to figure out a new way to do it. And I think that, what I saw myself doing and following my colleagues through their campaigns, they were all doing the same thing. What were we doing? We were delivering meals to seniors. We were out in the community helping folks with issues that, frankly, we never even considered because of COVID. We were figuring out ways to get kids Chromebooks and iPads so they could go to school. So for me, it was just like, what do? We revert back to the old, forget if you're a state senator or forget if you're a candidate, or just be a good citizen. And what does being a good citizen look like right now? And that's what it was. So a lot of it wasn't very glamorous. We weren't doing big forums. We weren't talking to groups of 200 people. We were standing out on a street corner handing out groceries. But guess what? That's what needed to happen in the moment. It's what we did. And, I think at the end of the day, what it really meant was the people that came out to support us on November 3rd saw that and understood that. And it's partly the reason that we're here today. So for me, I would say that campaigning during COVID was really just being a good citizen, and it worked.
Senator Hinchey.
I think that's exactly right. We had the same mentality. I think as soon as, when COVID kind of overtook all of our lives, right towards the middle of petitioning, right? And so we kind of shifted everything to how do we keep people safe and what do we do? And it was just calling. And I obviously know my colleagues did the same, how can you help? Where can you show up? I was just calling People's Place saying, hi, can I come help you pack meals, right? And pack bags for people and trying to do that all over the district to also get a sense of what the needs were too, right? Because if we're running to represent the district, one, it's to help people, and when better to help people than in the middle of a global pandemic. But two, you have to know the problems to be able to go to Albany and try to solve them. And so, we were at a food pantry in Amsterdam in Montgomery County, and they usually served about 200 families a week. When I was there, we served well over 700. That was in the beginning of the pandemic. And so to see that scale, I think really set the stage and really set the tone for what we were going through. And then that just drove even further, exactly like Mike was saying, I mean, how much more we can do, whether it's, doing our own drives, our hygiene drives and food drives, being in different places, sharing information. We made a COVID resource guide. We basically much suspended our campaign and just made it a information sharing so people knew where to go. And we had seen COVID guides popping up in different parts of the state, and we didn't see one locally. And so we tried to compile something for all 5 counties that was like, if you need help, here are all the resources for food. Here are the resources for online education for kids. You could go to the Met virtually. How do you take a tour of the national parks, right? What are these things that people are looking for things to do, and their hands are tied. We're trying to fill in those gaps as best as possible. And I think the other piece too that was touched on is it really allowed us to be creative. And I think it's right. I mean, with 20, I'm not the best at technology, I'll admit that, but I have some, understanding and, understanding with it. And so, we just started holding Facebook town halls and forums, right? And bringing people together, doing a real conversation with one of our first responders to talk about what their experience had been through COVID, what their life was like before, during, and in rural communities, what people should be thinking about, and trying to bring different leaders to the table just to help educate people and let them know what was going on and the kinds of things the priorities that we were seeing, and trying to bubble them up to the top. And so, it's a lot of phone calls, not a lot of door knocking, but it actually made it to Elijah's point. It was a little bit nice in the fact that we could do a couple of different virtual house parties, right? And just get to know people in all over our district on the same day without having to factor in travel time. And so for a district like ours, where, 140 miles top to bottom, that's really helpful when you can get out to Greene County and Altamont, Canajoharie and Ulster all in an afternoon. So we made a point to do that as much as possible, while also filling in those other gaps of helping people and just being present.
So you survive the campaign and you win. And what did that moment feel like? Obviously better than losing, but was there a, well, now what kind of moment for you?
I can jump in there too, briefly. We went to absentees. We had about 30,000 absentees. And so we didn't know officially that we won until almost December, right? It was the end of November. And so there wasn't kind of a long time to do the now what. It was kind of a, okay, we're here kind of a thing. I mean, we won, and that afternoon it was like, okay, so what does our team look like? Where do we look for office space? 2 days later, we're on a conference Zoom with our colleagues talking about the emergency session they called in December. So we were immediately into it. So we didn't actually have kind of that grace period to let it sink in, to kind of reflect on the work that we had done, reflect on flipping the seat, what that meant for the community, and even be scared about it, right? Or to be nervous about it, because we had to go straight into action. So, which is, kind of beneficial, because it forced us to do everything pretty quickly in a great way, and really get a taste of the job pretty immediately and instantaneously.
All right. Elijah, how about you?
So, I mean, somewhat like Michelle, there was, first of all, everything was remote. So this was not a year when we could have a big, election night party to celebrate or anything like that. And I also had a race that went to absentees on election, which I had suspected would be needed, because there was such a wide partisan breakdown this year of who was voting absentee versus who was voting in person, really around the country. And so I finished election day about 3,000 votes behind, although I felt on election day, I think my race was not nearly as close overall as the two of my colleagues. I felt really good, because I knew that we had about 30,000 absentee ballots that I expected to certainly trend in my direction. And so being very narrowly behind, I was reasonably sure I was going to win, but there's this sort of frustrating limbo. And then when you finally win, it's a couple weeks after the election, the energy's drained out. So it was more a sense of, my God, I'm so happy this is finally done. We've been doing this for such a long time, and it is really exciting. It's an incredible feeling, but without that sort of energy of the room full of people and, friends and family. And I think when it was sort of confirmed, it was there with, with my campaign manager basically, and But nevertheless, knowing how much there was, work to do, incredibly exciting and honestly a bit surreal for a long time to get over this sense of, this actually happened. And I'm sure that most people who've been in this position, unless you come into it with an enormous ego where you just assume this was owed to you, and I don't think too many of us do that, there's always going to be a sense of, incredulity that this could actually have been real. And, that yes, in fact, I was honored and to have won and be in this position to help people.
Mike, how about for you? What was that moment like?
So Elijah and Michelle hit it right on the head, right? I was in the same sort of situation, a race that was separated, that was ultimately decided by 1%. We all lived through an interesting November, to say the least. But I think maybe rather than kind of like reiterate exactly what they just said, one of my experiences sort of after everything was final, weeks and weeks after actually election night, what was really kind of a great experience for me was, my phone began to blow up, and it was everyone reaching out to me to say, how can we help? And when I say that, what I mean is even people who were on the opposite side of this race during the campaign. I'm talking about in my district, Democrat mayors. I'm talking about our colleague, Senator James Skoufis, who's a friend, who reached out to me and said, how do I help you, Mike? So those sorts of things, I think really are emblematic of the approach that all of us take to our job, because there's a campaign and then there's our job, right? And ultimately, our job is to work together for the good of the people that we represent. So I thought it was really awesome, frankly, to kind of, after things were set in stone and after things were done, not only to hear, again, from my friends, I say my friends during the campaign, but hear from new friends, people that I'm going to be working with, including some of my colleagues right here on the Zoom, who reach out and say, look, we're looking forward to working together. Let's get to work. So I think that, for me, there was sort of like that wow moment, like, oh my gosh, the first time somebody calls you senator and you're like, who are you talking to? You're talking to me? Right? But then right after that, where you say, okay, now it's time to depart from the campaign and leave that behind and move forward with doing our work. So I would say that was really probably one of the most, I guess, really, I don't want to say heartening, but it shows you how much promise is here, right? It was really like a really promising moment, like I said, to kind of wake up that next morning after everything was official. I think it's 4th, it was significantly after November 4th, but and to be reached out by so many people who not only just said it, by the way, but who also meant it in terms of helping me get off the ground and being productive from day one.
It's really comforting to hear that. So now that you're state senators for all of 4 months, you said about 100 days, right? What are some of the things that have caused you to say, well, I didn't know that was part of the job? Have there been surprises that are good or bad? Mike, we can start with you.
Sure. So look, Michelle, the answer is everything. I guess what I didn't realize was everything is my job now. Everything. When I say everything, I say it jokingly, but it's sort of fun, right? I mean, people call me about federal issues. They call me about their neighbor's dog barking too loud. They call me, we have lovely people who we love, who call us refrigerator breaks. What do we do, right? So I guess the answer sort of is we hear from everyone across the spectrum. Michelle was talking about this going shopping at the mall with her dad, right? When people would talk to him about everything under the sun. So I think that for me, I thought, well, there's kind of two components to the job. There's what we do in Albany, and then there's what we do in the district. But I guess I really didn't understand that, the biggest thing, and really for me, the part of the job that I enjoy the most is just helping people. And what does that help look like? Like I said, it could be helping people with get a prescription medication filled because they don't know how to get health insurance. Or like I said, it could be your neighbor's dog barking too loud, or your sidewalks that are uneven in front of your house. I mean, you name it, we deal with it here. So a day does not go by where I don't get a new issue that gets thrown at our plate. And frankly, I say, like, I didn't even know that was a problem. I didn't even know that issue existed. So it certainly keeps us on our toes, that's for sure.
Michelle, how about you? Any surprises?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I kind of came in with my eyes very open into having the spectrum of things, but it's never boring, the calls we get. And that's what keeps it exciting, right? Because we're here to help people. We're here to solve those problems, and to have see the different lives everybody is living is really great. One of the things that kind of surprised me a little bit in a great way was just how much access and influence we would have as freshmen senators. Our colleagues are amazing, and are very welcoming and want to hear our opinions. And, I have arguably the most rural and quite largest district in our majority conference. And so a lot of the issues that we face some of them overlap similarly with my colleagues, but many of them are very different. And there are different ways of life and there are different constituencies. And so I often find myself being one of the only, if not the only, voice bringing up some of the issues and concerns that we have, or thinking about something with an angle towards more rural upstate. And that's why I ran. I ran to be an upstate voice in the majority conference, and to be able to do that and to have my colleagues listen and take what we're saying and really implement that then into either bills that they're working on or other things. Specifically with the MRTA, that was a bill that's been around. My colleagues have been working on for nearly a decade. And when we got here, we were able to say, hey, some of this language doesn't actually work for small farmers, or what about this hemp piece that actually was left out in regulations, but is critical for farmers to get into this industry. Those were things that weren't really included in the legislation. We brought it up, worked with a sponsor, and they are now law. They are now part of it. And to be able to have that kind of, influence is the wrong word, but to be at the table so early, that was, 2 months into being in office, to be able to really affect change for the community is something I didn't know how long that was going to take or how accessible, we would be to kind of get into those spaces, especially those that were here before us. But it's been really wonderful to be able to do that.
Elijah, what surprised you?
So actually, some of what Michelle said, definitely, I agree with that. That the ability as a freshman or a first-year senator to really, take a leadership role. They majority had a wonderful idea to give each of us the chairmanship or chairpersonship of a committee. So I'm honored to chair the Committee on Procurement and Contracts, which was a newly created committee focusing on the very large and influential state procurement process that spends hundreds of millions of dollars every year. I think based on the US Senate, that it's all about seniority. It's all about, you have to have done your time and been there for a decade before you can do anything. And that's just not the case. We are all welcomed in as first-year senators to these conversations. Nobody's telling us to sit down and shut up and wait our turn. Which is great. And, I haven't needed to reach out to the majority leader for too much, but when I do, she'll take the call. She'll work. She'll try to help out in the district. I think the one other thing I have noticed is, although I certainly, having observed my former boss with the work he was doing, I knew there was a lot to come in, emails and phone calls and meetings and everything else. I could see how busy he was, and somehow you don't quite realize it until you're the one doing that. There is never an end to the meeting requests, to the email. I have 4 email inboxes now. I've got, Facebook to check and this to check and Twitter and all. You could truly spend your life just responding to other people. And so what I have found is really important is to try to set time aside to make sure that I'm not just being responsive, but being proactive about coming up with ideas and solutions and doing what I want to do, not just responding to what other people want me to do.
All right, so I'm going to jump in here, and thanks, Michelle, for moderating the first half. So 2 things struck me sitting and getting to listen to the 3 of you, which is 1, inspiring. That is a word that comes by listening to all 3 of you. And the second one is, I didn't hear Democrat or Republican mentioned for 30 minutes. And I just, maybe Michelle got the closest, being in the majority party, but never mentioned the labels. It was just about the work that you knew that you would have to do. So let's turn to that work, and let's start with, you get elected, and there's a tradition in that Cuomo wanted to have on-time budgets April 1st, only you're now doing it during COVID. You're now trying to figure out how to communicate with your colleagues. What was your first budget like? Michelle, let's start with you. What was your first budget like?
I actually thought it was great, but people say budget starts early. I didn't realize budget started week 2. I didn't realize it was that early, so that was kind of a shock where, you have a couple of meetings and all of a sudden the next week you get a message that says, so you're presenting on your budget and bring it forward. Like, I haven't even seen a presentation on a budget and I'm supposed to be presenting on one. It starts really early. But even with that, as we were saying earlier, our colleagues are so inclusive and so welcoming that it's actually much less of a scary thing to head into, even knowing how important it is and how much there is to do and how we for what we need. The agriculture budget is the committee that I chair. Is so critically important. It's important to our economy. It's important to jobs. It's important to our food and our sustainability. It's important to climate change. But it's something that, for many reasons, isn't always front and center in a lot of people's minds. And so it was my job to make the case for that and to talk about why it was so important, which was, again, a really early kind of leadership place to take as a freshman in a budget that is so large and all consuming for our state. New York is an ag state. But so I think, didn't realize it started so early. Doing everything virtually and on Zoom is just hard. It allows us to kind of do those meetings anytime and anywhere. However, you miss the in-person conversations. You miss some of that information sharing. You miss some of the things that you need to be able to really formulate your opinions and move forward, unless you are actively seeking it. Right. And so we had, for myself and my team, we had a checklist every day that was, okay, here are our priorities, and let's make 20 phone calls a day to anyone who will answer our call to find out, where these things stand outside of, our purview, and to put our voice in to say these things are important. And again, here's why, so it was definitely not the budget experience that I think any of us thought that we would be heading into. Being in the room and be able to really debate it and talk it out and figure out strategy would have been nice. I look forward to that for next year. But I think even with that, we came out with a budget that I know I'm really proud of, and I think will help a lot of people. And so we were still able to kind of overcome those challenges and overcome being thrown right into the fire to be able to do something that I think really helps, especially, incredible small business funding, right? I mean, unprecedented levels of things for people in upstate New York, the things that we need for the first time ever. So even with the challenges, I think we were all able to really come to the table and have those discussions and move and hear the priorities and move them forward.
So Mike, the experience now for you?
So, certainly, Jonathan, a little different on the minority side, but so maybe I'll take you kind of through, I think, budget, from my end. A little different, obviously, because so when you're in the minority, you play a role in budget, but it's played a little differently. For me, what it's about was getting to Albany, as Michelle said, figuring out the lay of the land as quickly as you can, and really from the minority side, the key to being effective is building relationships. And, I would tell you that all the folks on this call, including my colleagues, I don't have the opportunity to serve on either of their committees. So I really can't speak to, the work that they were doing. But the process that Michelle just outlined is the process that many of the committee chairs follow as they begin to prioritize budget. So just as an example, I serve as the ranking member of Senator Kaplan's Committee on Small Business, Commerce, and Economic Development. I had an opportunity to forge a relationship with her very early. And Senator Kaplan was very open to working with me, hearing things, especially from my perspective as a business person, looks like from your perspective. So there are tons of opportunities to be effective. But from my end, it's all about forging those relationships and being willing to work with others in compromise. Because, I would say certainly those who I've built relationships with in the majority, they've all been open and willing to talk to me. They've all been willing to receive feedback and input, which has been huge. The other thing I think I'll just mention about the budget process, certainly, I think that was different this year than others, were the many issues surrounding our government. We hope that that's not an issue, but in either case, I think that much like the folks that we represent, it's our obligation to serpentine and adapt and figure our way around challenges, and we definitely did that.
Elijah?
Yeah, so I think there's certainly, it was a very weird budget year because of COVID and the fact that there weren't the kind of in-person meetings that there usually would be. I talked to colleagues who've been in the legislature for many, many years. And they said this is by far the strangest budget year they'd seen. It was the hardest to get information, both because of the lack of in-person meetings and contacts. Also, I know we've had issues that have been reported in the press in the Democratic conference and the majority conference, where discussions keep getting leaked to the media. And so that made it more challenging, I think, for leadership to share a lot of information proactively with rank and file members, because there just seems to be time after time, they would tell us something in our majority conference, and then the Daily News would have a story about it half an hour later. And it's really toxic to the ability to get work done. I mean, you imagine any of your private business meetings and all of a sudden it's on the front page of the newspaper. That is a problem. So we got to work to overcome that. As Michelle was sort of saying, a lot of that took the place of having to just reach out ourselves, make phone calls to leadership, make phone calls to people involved at the central level and figure out, what's going on. But I felt like as a freshman member, my concerns really did get incorporated and heard. I went into the budget with two big issues that we needed to resolve. The governor had proposed completely closing and cutting the Rockland Children's Psychiatric Center, which if he had done that, this is the only inpatient facility that serves children with mental health needs between the Bronx and Utica. And they serve a lot of children, not just from my district in Rockland, but I think Orange County has the largest number of kids going there. So these would have been kids with no real options for what to do. We had to fight that and did, and put together a bipartisan coalition and really made it clear. And leadership heard this, I think, from all members who were impacted. We can't allow this to go through. And the final budget didn't. It kept it open. And then the school funding was another major issue, which I had prioritized. I know many others did, and made that really clear. As we are bringing in new revenue to New York, we have got to use it for helping out local school districts that are struggling because of the pandemic. And then not only does that help the district hire teachers, pay for the services, pay for the building improvements needed because of COVID, it's been helping taxpayers, because in my Senate district, at least, more than half of the school districts have now proposed budgets with a 0% tax increase this year because of all the additional state aid that's coming in. And unlike the federal aid, which is amazing, I mean, it dwarfs what we can provide at the state, but it's a one shot. Nobody expects Washington to send this level of assistance to school districts year after year, but we have put in place permanent, ongoing increases in state funding for education, which I think bear fruit for taxpayers too.
So let me use that as a jumping off point then to also ask Michelle and Mike, as difficult as this year was, being freshmen, Michelle, was there something that you were happy about that you could bring back to the district?
Yeah, there was a lot. I'll touch on them really quickly. The first thing was funding for the Catskills Park. When we think about environmental funding, we always think about the Adirondacks, but the Catskills are huge and so important, and especially during COVID, with in-state tourism increasing. The first park you get to when you're traveling upstate from downstate is the Catskills. And so we saw a major influx in tourism, which is great for our economies and our local economies. And we need that. We want it. We love it. But at the same time, our natural resources, because we don't have the regular funding, we don't have the stewards, we don't have the forest rangers, we don't have the infrastructure, we're really struggling. And so what we fought for very seriously, and we're able to deliver this year for the first time ever, was funding for the Catskills Park on par with the Adirondacks. We were able to, in an overusage fund in the EPF, we were able to get the Catskills included in that to split the money with the Adirondacks, which is huge. And we were able to get an additional funding line for the Catskills to help with stewards and forest rangers and other things, as I've said, in infrastructure. And so that was critical, and really excited about that. Another thing, I joke in our conference that I've become known as the broadband lady, because at every chance I get, I talk about the lack of access to broadband. Both affordability is something that's critically important, but access points, like people don't even realize that there are communities that just don't have the infrastructure for broadband. And if you live in one of those communities, you knew it was a problem before COVID. but it has been elevated and exacerbated during this pandemic. I mean, people are driving miles and miles and miles to sit in a library parking lot to get spotty Wi-Fi. Good. I mean, the libraries have been saviors, right? I mean, and some of the towns making parks. I mean, in Saugerties, they made Cantine Field a public Wi-Fi space. You know, that's great, but not everyone can do that, nor should they have to. You know, if you're a family with one car and you have to choose between getting to work or bringing your kid to the library to do their homework, I mean, how do you make that choice? It's an impossible choice to make. And, you know, there was a bill last year that was vetoed by the governor, and we made it a priority for us to get that included in this budget. It was vetoed because it had a supposed fiscal. So we knew the only way to be able to do that was to get it in the budget. And, you know, a number of us made a really concerted effort, and it is. And that bill will now, for the first time ever, get us household level mapping data, so that we can understand where the gaps are really. I mean, again, if you live in one, you know it's one, but we don't have that formally. And that's what we need to really be able to move forward and make sure that we're building out appropriately and working with the providers to figure out how to do that, you know, in both an economic way that makes sense, as well as a way that really works for people in the communities. Another thing I'll touch on too, sorry, but that I'm really excited about is the small business funding. You know, we have $1 billion in small business funding, and those are our small businesses are the backbones of so many of our communities. You know, I mean, they're the ones who stepped up during this pandemic. Their doors were closed and they were still donating meals, many of our restaurants. You know, they're the ones that support the little leagues. So to be able to fight for that really strongly and to see that deliver in a real way was a really big win.
And on broadband, I think it's really important what you folks did, because previously I think it had been measured by census tract, and that was just completely wrong. It gave such a, you know, the wrong perception of coverage, and it really was very important what you did there. Mike, even harder for you, your first year, you're in the minority party, but anything that, you know, you could start to point to, it will build.
Yeah.
And I need you to be successful because you're my state senator.
So Jonathan, you know, I talked about approach before. So let me tell you, I ran into a very similar issue as Elijah. So in the governor's executive budget proposal, he proposed closing the Goshen Secure Center, which is an OCFS Secure Center right in the center of my district in Goshen. Many good paying CSEA and PEF union jobs at that facility. This is a budget that should have been a jobs first budget. And here our governor is out cutting jobs from this budget. So what did I do, right? We talk about understanding your role and being effective. I picked up my phone and I called my friend James Scoofus and I said, James, I need help. I have an issue here and I know that this is going to be something that you can help me with. And you know what he said? He said, Mike, I'm glad to help you, right? And that's what I'm talking about when I say being effective and working across the aisle on issues that are important. So much like Elijah did in Reichlin, where he set up a bipartisan coalition to fight the closure of a facility that provided great service to young people, I was tasked with doing the same. And I approached it, frankly, the same way that Elijah did, in terms of putting together the right group of people on this issue. And we pushed back against that closure and successfully made sure that that facility stayed open. You know, there were 4 facility closures that were proposed in the governor's executive budget proposal. And in fact, 2 facilities in our state were closed. So what I would tell you about my approach is that the approach was effective, it worked, it was about collaboration. So I think that there are examples that you can point to, certainly even being a member of the minority conference, to say, yes, there are ways that we can be effective. There are ways that we can win. And it's all about working together. It's about sharing priorities. It's about working together. It's about putting people first. If you do all those things, you can still be effective. You know, the other piece I would tell you kind of a little more broadly and globally is being part of a very small conference. We have the opportunity to serve in a lot of committees, which is also a blessing sort of in disguise, because we get to wear a lot of hats. And so one of the hats that I get to wear is also as the ranking member of the Disabilities Committee. And I work with Senator Mannion, who's from the Syracuse area, on that committee. And one of the big issues that we hit right out of the gate was a $350 million funding reduction that was made midstream last year by the governor's budget director to IDD providers around our state, which was absolutely crippling to them. And one of the very first things I did when I got to Albany was I entered a bill, which thankfully today is not necessary any longer, that said if we receive federal aid, the first thing we should do is restore $350 million of cuts to the IDD community. And look, I entered that bill knowing that the bill probably wouldn't pass, but it's a tool that I can use to make sure that we prioritize an important piece in the budget. My colleague, Senator Mannion, shared my sentiment on that issue and made sure that that issue was brought to the table, and we successfully were able to push back against those cuts, making sure that they were fully restored with even more resources going to that important piece. So look, again, for me, Jonathan, I would tell you, a lot of it is about running a mile to pick up a foot, but I come with a lot of energy, willing to run hard. And I think that even here for the 42nd District, while I didn't agree with a large portions of this budget, I am one of a few Republicans that voted for portions of this budget because there certainly were good things in this budget. And I was glad to support components of it for sure. And that was just one example, I think, of using the approach that I intend to take moving forward to make sure we deliver for people who live here.
Thanks, Mike. Look, one of my concerns is that as fortunately we move past COVID, the pandemic, there is some people that will say, let's get back to normal, whatever that is. But COVID, I think, as Michelle was talking about, at least one really good example is broadband. We needed improved broadband for remote work. We needed it for virtual learning, telehealth, especially in rural areas. So are there examples of things that you got to observe in the last 14 months that are, either deficiencies or innovations that you as state senators would either take to the budget process or to the legislative process? And Michelle, let's start with you and we'll build on broadband.
Sure. I mean, I could talk
or wherever else you want to go.
I'll talk about broadband all day, but I think that's, I think that, the first step for us there is this mapping study, because you're right, it was done by census tracts, which for rural communities does not work. And so this is the first step to change that. And I do think there's been a full conscious shift to understanding that we need, it's no longer a luxury. Broadband is a necessity. It's basically a utility at this point, right? Like everyone's expected to have it. We got to have it. So this is the first step in doing that. And we are closely monitoring that timeline and all the things we need to do after we get that data back to make sure that we drive that out. One thing I think was a really beautiful thing to come out of COVID that we're working on, and I was hopeful that it would be in the budget, but we passed it as a one house, and we're hoping that it will be that the Assembly will pass too, is the Nourish New York program. What we saw during COVID, as we all know, and President Biden touched on this in his remarks last night, no matter where you lived, there were lines of cars or people on sidewalks looking for food. Food insecurity is real. And as I said earlier, New York is an ag state. The fact that we have such high food insecurity in this state is atrocious. And that's because of lack of investment in agriculture and lack of real understanding that we have to have locally sourced healthy food here in our state. We can't be dependent on bigger farms in the Midwest, because when those supply chains break, as they do, they're highly fragile. What are we left with? And we saw that firsthand during this pandemic. And what the Nourish New York program did was it connected upstate farms with food banks and food pantries across the state, especially in New York City and downstate in the boroughs, because that's where the food insecurity is the highest. And it basically we all saw the pictures of farmers dumping milk. I'll say it was day 55 when we finally addressed that in the comments, which day 55, but finally we were able to, as a state, purchase surplus food from our farmers and bring that healthy food to people in need. That's a program that is an incredible program. It shows how much stronger we are as a state when we all work together. It's a bipartisan program. It brings upstate and downstate together. It shows that our needs are complementary to each other and we can really work to strengthen them. And so we have a bill that with co-prime by Senator Borrello, the ranking member on agriculture, and carried by Assemblywoman Catalina Cruz in New York City to make that program permanent. And we think that would be a beautiful thing, and to make it even outside of just surplus goods, to purchase food from farmers and to deliver them regularly to food banks and food pantries. And so we are hopeful we pass that in the Senate. We are hopeful that the Assembly will pass it as well and make that a permanent program. And that's something that came out of COVID.
Elijah, something you observed that you'd like to translate into either legislation or a program?
I think, well, I talked a little bit about education and the need, especially, COVID kind of underlined just how weird and ineffective our education funding system has been, where we ask local property taxpayers to just pick up a huge share of it rather than having the state kick in what I think we ought to be doing to help equalize that and particularly help out higher tax regions like the Hudson Valley. So certainly ongoing state level support for education, which can, I think, spread the burden much more fairly across New York rather than asking our region to pay such a disproportionate cost is key. But the other area is in the healthcare realm. One of the things COVID underlined is we have a huge shortage of healthcare providers in many of our communities. We have a nursing shortage, both in hospitals and in nursing homes. COVID has driven people out of that business too. I've heard so many stories of nurses who have just been so burnt out by the last 15 months that after this pandemic ends, they're retiring, they're getting out. And I think there are not as many people seeing what the medical profession went through and this unending year plus of nonstop, emergency shifts. They're not going to want to get into the field. So I actually have a legislation which I'm sponsoring with your Assemblywoman, Aileen Gunther, a former nurse, the Nursing Shortage Correction Act, to really work with schools of nursing and figure out ways that the state can encourage and nursing schools can encourage more people to get into the field and incentivize that to happen, because otherwise we're going to have an absolute crisis a few years out as some of our more senior nurses retire. And particularly in rural areas, people aren't there to take up the slack.
All right, Mike, what may you have observed that you want to say we've got to fix this?
So Jonathan, I think there are a couple of things certainly that COVID has magnified and really put in the forefront and put on our table to address. Like Michelle, I represent a very rural district, and I think that some of the technology pieces, Michelle addressed the broadband piece. So I think I'm going to point to some other things that I think that we as a legislature in general have a ripeness to address. I mean, certainly we've seen the importance of telehealth and the video health in terms of accessing very rural communities, folks that don't have good access to healthcare for a lot of the reasons that Elijah just talked about. A lot of rural schools don't have the ability to have STEM or AP engineering type programs in their schools because their school districts, like where you're from in Sullivan County, have 800 students K-12 or 1,200 students K-12, not the larger schools like where Elijah's from. So when you look at technology's ability to bring programming to rural students, that's something that we have to be pushing moving forward. Pre-K was a huge portion of this year's state budget. It was made a huge priority. But when you look at a lot of early intervention services that are provided to kids, our speech therapists went online for the first time, to provide services to kids. And while I completely understand that it's not the same as providing in-person services, we have families that don't have access to reliable transportation to drive a child 30 miles one way to get speech therapy or OT. So these are opportunities as we move forward from my perspective, especially for regions like I represent, where those services are not regularly available, to go and pick some of the good things that have come out of COVID. Look, I'm not a big fan of a lot of the executive orders. I'm not a big fan of most of them, but there are some that allow, like for reimbursement, for example, for a lot of our providers in these sorts of environments that should and need to be preserved, because it does provide services to folks who ordinarily wouldn't have access to them or easily wouldn't have access to them. So there are certainly good things that we can point to, and I feel good that this legislature has, again, a ripeness to really address these things now for the good of all New Yorkers, and I guess a little selfishly, especially for Michelle and I, the good of rural New Yorkers, which I think a lot of these will provide a specific benefit.
So we're out of time, and I want to thank Michelle and Mike and Elijah. Your energy is infectious, and may that be something that we can pass on to other residents of the Hudson Valley to say, get involved. There's so much work that needs to be done, and thank you all for participating this morning. On behalf of Pattern, I want to wish all of our sponsors a thank you. Also to Michelle Pfeffer, thank you for co-moderating with us, and I wish all of the people listening and all the people that will see this subsequent to today